There's another article that I was reading from Andrew Neil on Mail Plus, which I'm reading through a paywall remover. Thank you, 12foot.io. Much appreciated for letting me read Andrew Neil without having to give him any money. I do appreciate that. The last place I would want any of my money to go would be Andrew Neil or the Daily Mail's pockets. This article was tweeted out from him by saying that the Conservative Party aren't being conservative enough, which is obviously the title of this. Next year he'll lose because he's not being Tory enough or even Tory at all. And I'm trying to find out what his justification for calling him not Tory is. So I've read through the first half of this. I couldn't find out what he could possibly be referring to with this very silly comment. But let's find out, shall we? Sunak's biggest problem is the economy. After a year in power, it is still mired in sclerotic growth, stubbornly strong inflation, a record high tax burden, a fierce cost of living squeeze, rising national debt, and stagnant productivity, which hinders increased prosperity. I can't believe I'm going to defend Rishi Sunak here. Do you think Andrew Neil realises how supply chain shocks work? How cost-push inflation works? What that link is to stagflation? And how there is no easy fiscal answer to deal with stagflation? Does he not know that? Does he not understand how stagflation works? I mean, rising national debt has been the case throughout the entirety of the Conservative administration. They've never got the national debt down at all. The debt to GDP ratio has continued to increase year upon year upon year since they took power. So where he's getting this idea that this has come out unconservative in terms of a change from previous, when just how every Conservative Prime Minister has worked, I don't know what he's trying to say there. And productivity has been a problem ever since the global financial crisis, which hasn't been helped by austerity, hasn't been helped by failing public services. It hasn't been helped by the casualisation of our workforce and there being no incentive to want to be productive and a tax system that favours the owners rather than the workers. What do I know? I'm just a randomer on YouTube and Twitch. It is a dismal catalogue of woe which has condemned the Sunak government for inaction. No radical supply-side reforms, such as a bonfire of red tape to pep up the economy a la Thatcher, because of course that always works, right? That's always a way of being able to get growth out of nowhere, just to cut all the red tape. What little red tape that we have left in this country. No tax cuts to encourage enterprise and incentives, which we tried. We tried that, Andrew. We tried that in September last year, and you don't need me to remind you what the results were for unfunded tax cuts. And they were paid through increasing the national debt, which you say apparently we can't do because financing that debt would be too expensive, even though we are a sovereign currency issuer. But again, what do I know? I am just a randomer on YouTube. No strategy for growth, without which nothing is possible. I mean, true, the one thing that we had that was a pro-growth measure, which was HS2, he's decided to scrap anyway. Don't have any plan for like an industrial strategy. So in that case, he's kind of limping on. The big problem, though, is that the Conservative policy for everything is just throw money at the rich and then hope that it trickles down. And we've been trying that for 45 years, and it's failed every single year since then. We've always failed with trickle-down economics because it doesn't work. The real solution to our growth problem is stimulus. It's Keynesian stimulus, right? What we did for every single year of the economy from the end of the war until the rise of Thatcher, which worked really well at getting us continuous growth throughout that period, on infrastructure, on state spending, on having a functioning public sector. But of course, Tories don't want to do this, right? It's a very Tory position for him not to want to increase the national debt to fund infrastructure projects for growth. So if anything, he's being very Tory by looking at this bind that he's got and saying, well, the thing that we could do, engage in Keynesian stimulus, I won't do because I'm a monetarist, which is a conservative position. So I'm not sure what he's saying here, Andrew Neil is. The consequences are enough to give any self-respecting Tory the heebie-jeebies. Over 6.5 million low-paid workers will start paying income tax again, reversing a decade of Tory efforts to keep them out of tax. But being progressive with your tax intake isn't a conservative measure. The idea that you're saying that they're being unconservative by having a more regressive tax system, that doesn't make any sense. All of the progressive taxation this country have done has come from the left. It's the right wingers who want to have our tax rate be more flat to be less progressive. So again, this makes no sense what he's saying here. I understand that low tax is a position that just conservatives will take, right? But low tax in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean progressive or regressive. So we have high tax regressive taxation and low tax progressive taxation. Those two things are positions that you can take. And I will personally say that progressive low taxation is more left-wing than regressive high taxation, which is what we have at the moment. Because being left or right-wing is more really about how you look about distribution, not whether or not you think tax happens or not. But to be fair, most people like Andrew Neil think that socialism is when the government does stuff, and the more stuff the government does, the socialister it is. So I don't think you can really take these people's economic opinions with any kind of intellectual rigour associated with them. Businesses face higher tax on profits with a corporate tax regime that has plummeted down the global competitive league tables. When we were the lowest in the G20? Did we get loads of capital investment from the private sector? No, it didn't happen. To quote Rachel Reeves in 2010, you can't just cut public sector investment and expect private sector investment to fill that gap. It never did, right? They took all of the extra money we gave and they plowed it into asset prices rather than investing in productive capacity. We've had some of the lowest investment in the G20, in the G7 as well, for the entirety of the austerity years, for the entirety of the low corporation tax years. Again, I'm going to defend Sunak and say that he was right, that the low corporation tax regime was not working as a method of stimulating investment. It hasn't worked. And he was right to say we need to change tack on that during the original leadership contest, this kind of fiscal realism that he got lauded for during that period at the very least, right? To be fair, if you want to conserve institutions of your country, if you want to conserve the stability for your country, random tax cuts that are unaffordable, looking at something going wrong and saying, let's continue with it because we don't know what else to do, that's not really a conservative policy either. So I'm not sure what Andrew's saying here. Together it amounts to a £52 billion tax grab in which families will pay considerably more tax for the privilege when they fall ill of joining the 7.6 million already on NHS waiting list. I feel like the least conservative thing possible is when you fail to invest in the state sector. Because of course, conservatism is when the state does nothing, and the closer to nothing it does, the more conservative it is. If Sunak goes down to defeat at the next election, it will not be because he's been too Tory, it will be because he's not been Tory enough, or even Tory at all. Because what he's done here, I've been coy about mocking Andrew for the kind of prescriptions that he's making here, but what he's really saying is he's not being neoliberal enough. And conservatism and neoliberalism are not the same thing. I know they're very synonymous nowadays, but would Harold Macmillan have done the kind of stuff that Liz Truss did? Of course he wouldn't. Would Anthony Eden have done the stuff that Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak were doing, that Boris Johnson was doing? No, of course they wouldn't. Actually, if they would have been closer to Boris Johnson, they would have been to Rishi Sunak. They wouldn't have done what George Osborne did, like the real kind of neoliberal types, right? Eden and Macmillan would never have done that. The old school kind of conservatives. But neoliberal conservatism is now the linchpin for all conservative thought in this country. I'm not surprised that conservatives feel very aggrieved with the state of governance at the moment, given that what they actually really want is just a kind of stable life to be able to live, rather than watching their elected representatives gargle the of a bunch of billionaire autocrats and plutarchs. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me what he's saying here, unless he thinks that all conservatism is neoliberalism, which absolutely isn't. It absolutely is not those things. There's a very new brand of conservatism, that you should blindly follow this idea of wanting to put money into the pockets of the already rich, right? So that's something that Edmund Burke would absolutely balk at. Time is running out for him. He continues to brandish his 5 pledges for 2023, halving inflation, growing the economy, cutting debt, reducing NHS waiting lists, stopping the small boats. Some he will succeed in delivering, such as inflation, which he's not actually done anything to deal with. Others he will fail. Debt, small boats, waiting lists, too little growth to notice, because he won't spend any money, because he's trying to be too conservative by not spending money from the state, which would fix these problems. Even if he does better, it will not be an election-winning prospectus. There is a last chance. The British people want to feel their own circumstances are improving again, that the worst cost of living crisis is behind them, and that they will live in a country which they can be proud in, which the things that matter work, which will require public investment. It will literally require public investment to do this. It will require proper working public services that you've already said don't work. It will involve actually investing in things that benefit everybody rather than a small elite, by using the public purse and distributing it to people who need it to avoid the cost of living crisis, to use the power of the state to be able to move the markets in such a position as which we avoid the sinks in our financial sector and where we spend our money, the monopolistic nature of the water companies and our transport system and our energy system, to ensure that we are not entirely cut down to corporations in the way that some other countries in Europe really just aren't. Even their conservative parties would admit this, right? The conservative parties in Europe are like truly conservative in the capital C sense. Our Conservative Party are just national looters, looty, rather than actually have a kind of conservative one nation prospectus. So you're actually asking them to be even less Tory than they already are. Even then, like, 2019 election was a landslide for Boris Johnson. This was a landslide result like the Conservatives could never have seen. And if Andrew Neil is to be believed by his own prescription on what does or does not constitute conservatism, Boris Johnson is the least conservative Prime Minister that we have had since Macmillan. What did he want to do? It's in the perfect sweet spot for a lot of parts of our society, right? A lot of the ideology of many of the older people in our society, right? He was pretty reactionary in his social opinions. He was definitely a social conservative in those opinions, outside of promising some progressive policy like a conversion therapy ban and extolling the virtues of multiculturalism. In fact, he was more welcoming for multiculturalism than Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak have been so far, ironically. It was better for the queer community than a bunch of these people are. If you could imagine such a thing. Boris Johnson not being the worst when it comes to the queer community. Somebody who described gay people as tank top boys is less queerphobic than Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And his economic prospectus was investing money in hospitals, spending state money levelling up the UK, having an industrial strategy almost, which was always a bit of a lie anyway. It was always never going to actually be followed through when it came into power. But the electoral manifesto that they were elected on was not a Conservative manifesto, if what Andrew Neil is purporting to be conservatism is to be believed. It was the opposite of that. It wasn't tax cuts for the rich. It was state investment for everybody. Not enough state investment. Not state investment that actually would have happened had he not just lied to try and get elected because he was a populist. If anything, Andrew Neil's theory here that they need to be more neoliberal is just the complete opposite. It's an upending of reality. People don't want no money in our public service. They want investment in our public services. We saw a poll from YouGov. The people do not care about the national debt. What they actually want to see is money being spent on public services. That's a clear, uniform belief across huge amounts of the country. They just want money invested in public services, and the national debt is nothing that they have as their concern. We saw that in the 2017 election. People weren't talking about the national debt anymore. They were talking about wanting investment in public services. And Boris Johnson ran on that manifesto in 2019 and won in a landslide, right? Operating benefits in line with inflation. They wanted controls on immigration, sure, they wanted to get Brexit done. But did they want an abandonment of net zero, or the ruinous net zero agenda, as Andrew Neil calls it? No, that's what Boris Johnson was elected on. He was elected on delivering HS2. All of these things have been completely disintegrated and thrown away by Rishi Sunak in the name of conservatism, the kind of neoliberal conservatism that Andrew Neil is espousing here. Because really, true, this is not a conservative versus liberal distinction here. This is a neoliberal versus liberal conservatism, right? They're both two different kind of strains of conservatism. But if you take Andrew Neil's definition, the neoliberal one, to be correct, then he's just completely wrong in basically every single possible sense of the word, based on what we already know people want when they get polled, what people want in what they voted for in 2019 as well. It's unreal, absolutely unreal that he can make these claims. But he just wants to, again, manufacture consent for neoliberal economics because that's all he believes in. He doesn't believe in having a strong country. He doesn't believe in having a patriotic duty to make our country as good as it can be. He doesn't believe in any of these things. He just believes in money. And a true conservative would have more values than just money. They would not subscribe to this idea of knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. They would not believe so. A true conservative would not believe that. And Scribby, to end this segment, has thankfully provided me with a clip of Harold Macmillan describing privatisation like selling the family silver. Let's watch.
It is very common with individuals or estates, when they run into financial difficulties, to find that they have to sell some of their assets. First, the Georgian silver goes. And all that nice furniture that used to be in the saloon. And then the Canalettos go. And then the most tasty morsel and the most productive of all, having got rid of cables and wireless, and having got rid of the only part of the railways that paid, and having got rid of part of steel industry that paid, and having sold this and that, the great thing of the monopoly of telephone system came from the market. They were like the two Rembrandts that were still left. And they went. Now we are promised in the King's Speech a further sale of anything that could be scraped up.
Couldn't say fairer than that, Harold. Couldn't say fairer than that. Again, I'm not saying that there is only one stream of conservatism. I think you're well in your rights to believe as a conservative that neoliberal economics is the one thing that should underpin your conservatism. But this is not the only type of conservatism. But really and truly, what I really wanted to get across with this segment was that the main thrust of Andrew Neil's argument here is that the one thing that could win the Conservatives the election is neoliberal economics. And the idea that this country wants more Thatcherism is just not borne out by any of the data. It's not borne out by the polling, and it's not borne out by what they voted for already, and what they're being offered in alternative from Keir Starmer that people are moving towards. As simple as that. There is no case for neoliberalism anymore, Andrew. You may want there to be, but people don't want to hear it. And people don't want it from Rishi Sunak either. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.